Eu vou convocar novamente a presidente do IFL São Paulo, Larissa Bonfim, para fazer a apresentação do próximo convidado, que eu confesso a vocês que eu tive a honra de conhecer mais cedo, Mr. Morton Blackwell. Ele foi um dos assessores principais dele, que é uma das minhas grandes referências pessoais enquanto comunicador, politicamente também, que foi o 40º presidente americano, Ronald Reagan. E realmente são várias histórias que ele vai contar aqui de como realmente vencer na política e através da voz da experiência. Realmente ele tem uma trajetória incomparável aí, realmente vendo as engrenagens da política e como fazer as suas ideias prosperarem na arena do debate público. Então, tenho certeza que vocês vão adorar conhecer essa figuraça, mas a devida apresentação vai ser feita pela presidente Larissa Bonfim. Por favor.
Muito obrigada. Agora sim. Muito obrigada, André, pela apresentação. Bom estar aqui no palco com vocês de novo. Boa noite. A gente vai agora para o nosso último painel. Nós passamos aqui um dia intenso, né? Juntos refletindo sobre os comportamentos de liderança. Falamos sobre resiliência, sobre disciplina, sobre como programar a sua mente para ter as atitudes desejadas. E, principalmente, falamos sobre os bons valores do líder. Mas ainda falta uma peça importante nesse quebra-cabeça. Como ser mais do que um bom líder? Como ser um verdadeiro protagonista? Para ser um verdadeiro protagonista, você precisa ser capaz de liderar outras lideranças. O verdadeiro protagonista se destaca entre outros líderes e assume um lugar importante na história. Sim, é desafiador. Apenas alguns vão chegar lá. O nosso próximo palestrante compreendeu o que é preciso para chegar lá. Ele desmistificou o que transforma líderes em verdadeiros protagonistas da história. Nosso próximo palestrante possui mais de 40 anos de experiência na preparação de lideranças. Ele fundou o Leadership Institute e assessorou nada menos que Ronald Reagan. Morton Blackwell desenvolveu um framework prático que chama de tecnologia política. São ferramentas que podem e devem ser transferidas para qualquer esfera de liderança. Nós, do IFL São Paulo, desafiamos vocês, agora, a absorverem esse conteúdo prático e darem o próximo passo. Provocamos vocês a irem além e a se transformarem em protagonistas. Fica com cada um de vocês hoje essa mensagem e esse desafio. Por favor, vamos dar boas-vindas ao nosso próximo palestrante. Please, Mr. Blackwell, the stage is yours.
Much for that kind introduction and for the kind invitation. I've spent my adult life building a conservative movement in the United States, and the idea that I might be of some assistance to you in building a conservative movement in your country is extremely attractive to me. And so I'm honored to be here and hope that some of the things that I say may be useful to you. I am not going to talk about Brazilian politics. I'm going to talk about movement building. Political terms mean different things in different countries, and they mean different things in the same countries at different times. In the United States and across the world in the 19th century, the word liberal described someone primarily concerned about liberty. Over the years, the word liberal, deliberately adopted by the left in the United States, has come to mean someone committed to, among other things, greater concentration of power in government, more government spending, and active opposition to traditional values. In modern American politics, liberal means left. And leftists have so sullied that word liberal in the United States that they now often prefer to call themselves progressive. Despite this changed but now familiar meaning of the word liberal, many free market economists across the world persist in calling themselves liberals. Those economists have every right to try to label themselves any way they please, even though that may make their communications more difficult for the general public to understand. In Tehran, Iran, people who hang on their walls honored photographs of the late Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini may be called conservatives. In Madrid, Spain, people who hang on their walls honored photos of the late Caudillo Francisco Franco may be called conservative. In Beijing, China, people who hang on their walls honored photographs of the late Chairman Mao Zedong may be called conservatives. The same word means different things in different contexts. In the United States today, someone who hangs on his wall an honored photograph of Ronald Reagan can be called a conservative, and most people now understand immediately that person is probably committed to limited government, free enterprise, strong national defense, and traditional values. For political purposes, these four principles are generally accepted in the United States as pillars of American conservatism. The engine of conservative politics in the United States is the conservative movement, and it began as a serious intellectual movement in the late 1950s. Its principles were already limited government, free enterprise, strong national defense, and traditional values. But it focused primarily on developing its ideas and on the important job of attracting others to those ideas. Typically, conservative intellectuals considered the nitty-gritty of political action beneath their dignity. They identified the errors and dangers of the left. They persuasively promoted an inspiring set of conservative ideas, and they did grow their movement. They formed some national conservative organizations which modestly prospered, without raising much money or identifying, much less activating, really large numbers of people. When they did try political action, those early movement conservatives in the U.S. chose to work almost entirely within the Republican Party. But that party was dominated by what we called Eastern establishment Republicans like Nelson Rockefeller, who seemed to have all the money, and as far as internal Republican matters were concerned, all the support of all the major print and broadcast media. The nascent conservative intellectual movement did manage to attract and recruit sufficient numbers of inexperienced but earnest grassroots conservative activists like me to nominate Barry Goldwater for president in 1964. But Lyndon Johnson's landslide victory that year produced confident and loud predictions that conservatism in the United States politics was dead for good. History did not work out that way. Starting in 1965, a number of former Goldwater supporters, including me, gravitated to the center of our national politics, the D.C. area. And hardly any of us had known each other earlier, much less had prominent roles in the Goldwater campaign. But our past personal support of Goldwater credentialed us to each other as we eventually met, sometimes by working together in election contests, legislative battles, or Republican Party organizations, but often met only by chance, and this process took several years. While I was executive director of the National College Republicans in the mid-1960s, I met a man named Lee Edwards. He had served high up in the Goldwater campaign as its director of information. Then he went to Washington, D.C. and opened a conservative public relations firm. His was the area's only conservative public relations firm. And the New York Times newspaper once called Lee Edwards the voice of the silent majority. Lee generously mentored me, and I supplied college Republican volunteers for conservative events that he organized. In early May 1972, while I worked at the American Enterprise Institute, Lee Edwards introduced me to his friend Richard Viguerie, who had served as executive director of Young Americans for Freedom, which was the youth group organized around the groundswell for Barry Goldwater. Richard Viguerie had moved to the D.C. area in 1965 to form what turned out to be a spectacularly successful direct mail consulting firm. For most conservatives, Viguerie was famous but a man of mystery. I had never met him in 7 years living in the same area. Viguerie worked very long hours building his business, and he did not circulate socially with what was then the very small circle of D.C. area conservatives. The story spread that Richard Viguerie had on the wall behind his desk a huge faucet which he could turn on in order to pour vast sums of money into the treasury of any organization he would take on as a client. He became known as the funding father of the conservative movement in the United States. A couple of weeks after our first meeting, Richard Viguerie offered me a job with his company. "Morton," he said, "I want you to come help me build the conservative movement." I accepted enthusiastically because building the conservative movement was exactly what I wanted to do. And the story of Viguerie's movement building in the 1970s has been told many times. No longer almost a recluse, Viguerie sought out philosophically sound conservatives who had proved themselves as activists in various areas of the public policy process. Most of them by this time already knew and trusted each other. Viguerie invited them often and hosted them at mostly small but innumerable meetings and meals to discuss, to figure out, and to implement what had to be done for conservatives to start beating the left in politics. As his political assistant for 9 years, I helped organize Viguerie's movement-building meetings and participated actively in them. The discussions often proved highly productive. Now, leaders of some previously existing good groups did not agree with some of the conclusions reached at our Viguerie meetings, particularly our decisions to encourage the creation of a wide variety of new conservative organizations and to persuade existing conservative groups to develop the skills required to grow dramatically in membership and in political effectiveness. Some of them felt creating new and larger organizations would only drain resources from the existing groups. Our response was that if conservatives couldn't increase our resources in numbers, we would never win. Jump-starting the conservative movement worked, and before long, new conservative groups of all types sprang up, doing good work in many conservative issue areas, First dozens, then hundreds, and now thousands of new groups. As a guide for conservatives wanting to start new public policy organizations or to expand existing ones, I wrote a booklet, The Conservative Organizational Entrepreneur. Empirically updated, that book, The Conservative Organizational Entrepreneur, is now easily accessible for free online. A number of long-established conservative organizations also grew dramatically in the 1970s. For example, the well-respected National Right to Work Committee that fights against compulsory membership in labor unions increased from 25,000 members in 1972 to more than 1,700,000 members in 1939. What had largely been a conservative intellectual movement grew into a formidable, workable coalition of better skilled, self-identified conservative activists and leaders able to defeat the left in many political contests, that is, in elections and legislative battles, and thereby to affect public policy. During those years of vigorous meetings, I summarized what participants had discovered. I described what made the big difference, which enabled the exciting and effective growth of conservative activity, the creation of which the news media began in the middle 1970s to describe as the new right. I called my summary, The Real Nature of Politics, and I have taught it to conservative and activist leaders ever since. And here it is, the real nature of politics. Being right in the sense of being correct is not sufficient to win. The winner in a political contest is determined over time by the number and the effectiveness of the activists on the respective sides. The number and effectiveness of the activists on a given side is determined by its use of political technology, which includes organizational technology and communications technology. Most political technology is philosophically neutral, which makes it inherently unattractive to people who are motivated by their philosophy. Nevertheless, you owe it to your philosophy to study how to win. You have a moral obligation to study how to win. To the extent possible, movement-oriented conservatives should develop activists and leaders who are philosophically sound, technologically proficient, and movement-oriented, that is, willing and anxious to work with others in common purposes. It's a lot easier to teach someone already solidly conservative the skills necessary to win than it is to make a committed conservative out of somebody who is already a skilled opportunist. But committed conservatives often resist the study of philosophically neutral techniques. Many of them think disdainfully, that's mere technology. I'm focused on the really important things. Young, unskilled conservatives who are nevertheless intellectuals and read ardently are greatly affected by what they read. Often their reading gives them an incomplete understanding of political reality, but they often can learn the real nature of politics through exposure to certain writings of famed conservative intellectuals whom they already deeply admire. As a conservative activist myself since 1960, I have read or heard reverently repeated innumerable times in the United States, ideas have consequences. Conservative intellectuals and would-be intellectuals are so enamored of the words ideas have consequences that probably each day some at the famous Heritage Foundation probably receives correspondence in which these words are written. The theme, ideas have consequences, so often crops up in conservative books and speeches and scholarly articles that for several years I cataloged each usage that I saw of that expression. And no meeting of the Philadelphia Society or of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute was complete unless someone solemnly intoned the words, ideas have consequences. The words appear often in the pages of National Review and in virtually every other conservative journal, including many with little pretense of intellectuality. There are now close to 100 independent conservative campus student publications in the United States. And because my Leadership Institute conducts student publications workshops, I see many of these campus efforts, and many of these publications explicitly affirm in their first issue that ideas have consequences. The proposition, ideas have consequences, has obtained talismanic status with young conservatives. I would not be surprised to learn that some budding conservative, having adopted this as his mantra, now sits quietly several minutes each day contemplating those three words. From time to time, I venture to question young conservatives have used in writing or in speech the refrain, ideas have consequences. Alas, even if they know it is the title of a book by a professor named Richard M. Weaver, the great majority of those who use the refrain have never held in their hands any book by Richard Weaver. Then what accounts for the frequency of these references? It is, I believe, a manifestation of hubris. The young person of conservative inclination, possessed of a growing vocabulary, and having gained some familiarity with conservative writings, readily concludes he is now capable of elevated thoughts beyond the reach of all but a tiny elite. Perhaps he finds, as I first did in 1960, the praise of Richard Weaver in the book, The Conservative Mind by Dr. Russell Kirk. But more than likely, he reads the magical title in a conservative journal. If the fascination of those three words merely increased the sense of self-worth among young conservatives, it would do little harm to the conservative cause. Unfortunately, the temptation is often overpowering to take the words literally. If ideas in and of themselves really do have consequences, then being right in the sense of being correct is sufficient. If you know you are right, particularly if you believe you can prove you are right, then your ideas will inevitably prevail. For a young person with intellectual aspirations, this is heady stuff. He concludes he need no longer work with mere mortals in their ordinary plane of existence. He feels elevated above them. He feels that they must eventually conform to his ideas. Thousands of young conservatives, caught up in the delight of thinking deep thoughts, find that the world does not treat them as they expect and as they believe they deserve. Public policy battles, for example, do not often turn on the question of who is provably right. Confronted with the failure of his ideas, who have their merited consequences, many a young conservative becomes embittered. Some, in the words of my late friend Dr. Warren Nutter of the University of Virginia, retreat to the citadel to save the books. Others become opportunists and quiet cynics. With great inner agony, some resign themselves to impotence in a world that does not function as it should, and too few discover how to make their ideas effective. For a number of reasons, it would not be fair to blame Richard Weaver for the problems associated with his magically titled book. He was a professor of rhetoric, which can be defined as ideas artfully presented. A master rhetorician, Weaver knew full well that ideas do not necessarily have consequences. Although it's dangerous to suggest how a deceased person would respond to current questions, I am confident that Weaver would affirm that ideas have consequences is, as he might put it, a rhetorically contracted enthymeme, an enthymeme being a syllogism with one or more of the elements missing but understood. So expanding Weaver's enthymeme, we can get the following syllogism. Ideas can motivate people to act. Actions have consequences. Therefore, ideas can have consequences. Without understanding Weaver's true meaning, some conservatives often give his three words a dangerously misplaced, almost religious devotion. A noble confidence in the truth of their ideas can lure them into the voluntary paralysis of a life of contemplation. For anyone who makes the effort to read the difficult but highly rewarding Richard Weaver, his meaning is brilliantly clear. In his book entitled Ideas Have Consequences, he actually wrote, quote, "The youth is an intellectual only, a believer in ideas, who thinks that ideas can overwhelm the world. The mature man passes beyond intellectuality to wisdom." Does this sound like a man who believes that ideas are effective without something else? Elsewhere in Ideas Have Consequences, Weaver wrote, "Organization always makes imperative counter-organization. A force in being is a threat to the unorganized who must answer by becoming organized themselves." Weaver warned powerfully against rootless, mechanistic manipulation, against knowledge, quote, of techniques rather than of ends, close quote. And his deserving target was the destructive tendency of modern man to lose his sense of purpose as he rapidly accumulates knowledge of how to do things. But it is a gross misunderstanding to suggest he argued against action. It would be fair to say he held that actions based on the right ideas will have desirable consequences. Now, he quite correctly gave absolute priority to ideals, but recognized the duty of philosophically sound people to take actions. In 1958, Weaver wrote an essay entitled "Up from Liberalism," a title he graciously later authorized William F. Buckley Jr. to use also for his delightful book of that same name. Russell Kirk called that 1958 essay Weaver's intellectual autobiography. In it, Weaver wrote, quote, "Somehow our education will have to recover the lost vision of the person as a creature of both intellect and will. It will have to bring together into one through its training the thinker and the doer, the dialectician and the rhetorician." This statement should enlighten anybody who takes the words "ideas have consequences" only at their simplistic literal value. Many conservative intellectuals and aspiring intellectuals still find comfort in the proposition that ideas have consequences. They can believe themselves thereby absolved of the awkward responsibility for personal actions. The world of politics is invariably imperfect and replete with compromises. How tempting it is to shield our principles from degenerating contact with such untidiness. Never mind that we simultaneously insulate the real world from the ennobling effect of practical contact with our principles. More than any other thinker, 18th century British statesman Edmund Burke is credited with laying the intellectual foundations of modern conservatism. He also provided and brilliantly communicated the arguments which activated Britain and much of Europe against the horrors inherent in the French Revolution. We cannot help but admire Burke's towering intellectual achievements for liberty and order. Burke was a practicing professional politician virtually all of his adult life. In him we see a principled man who during all of his long career took vigorous actions to promote his principles. A man who understood the proper relationship between ideas and actions. A man who stood by good causes even when it appeared those causes were losing. In 1770, Burke wrote, quote, "It is the business of the speculative philosopher to mark the proper ends of government. It is the business of the politician, who is the philosopher in action, to find out the proper means to those ends and to employ them with effect." Burke could not take seriously people who failed to act and act skillfully on their principles. He wrote, quote, "For my part, I find it impossible to conceive that anyone who believes his own politics or thinks them to be of any weight, who refuses to adopt the means of having them reduced into practice. In other words, you owe it to your philosophy, first, to study how to win, and second, to take appropriate actions to win if you can." Edmund Burke did not tell us all that is necessary to triumph over evil is for men to have enough good ideas. Quite the contrary. The most famous words attributed to Edmund Burke are, quote, "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." In one of his too few surviving letters, author Whittaker Chambers, who produced the seminal anti-communist book Witness, told how he had just burned several hundred pages of a book manuscript he had been working on. For those of us who considered Whittaker Chambers one of the great masters of our English language, the loss is tragic and irreparable. Those ideas are lost and will not have consequences. Didn't understand. Austrian economist and intellectual giant Ludwig von Mises, in the chapter he named "The Role of Ideas" in his book Human Action, said, quote, "Thinking is to deliberate beforehand over future action and to reflect afterwards upon past action. Thinking and acting are inseparable," said Mises. Particularly in our day, we cannot afford to encourage and concentrate on either ideas or actions to the neglect of the other. The conservative intellectual who avoids association with less elegant men of action may doom his cause. Chambers understood this, and he wrote, quote, "I do not ask of the man who lets me slip into his foxhole whether he believes in the ontological proof of God whether he likes me personally, or even whether in another part of the forest at another time he lobbed a grenade at me. I am interested only that for the duration of this war, he keeps his rifle clean and his trigger finger nerveless against a common enemy. I understand that that is all he wants of me. The reason for the increasing success of conservative ideas in the United States in recent years is not that our ideals are much more correct now than those that we held, say, in the Goldwater era. We prosper in many ways because we have begun to study the political process and to work together to implement our new knowledge. We must teach young intellectuals that a flattering and seductive talisman, which they do not fully understand, will not guarantee them success. They must not rely on victory falling into their deserving hands like a ripe fruit off of a tree. They have to earn it. Good ideas have desirable consequences only if we act intelligently for them. My Leadership Institute now offers 50 different types of training schools to teach conservatives how to be successful in government, politics, and the news media. Since I founded my Leadership Institute in 1979, more than 250,000 people have taken my training courses. For many years, mine was the only conservative organization focused on political training. All of the other conservative political educational organizations concentrated on the important task of teaching about conservative principles and public policy issues. However, I am pleased to report that in recent years, at least a dozen other national conservative and libertarian organizations in the United States have begun to offer useful training programs for successful political participation, and I commend those efforts. Now, I do not entirely neglect to provide philosophical education to my students. About 5,000 Leadership Institute students per year receive copies of a booklet that I wrote, and it is entitled Read to Lead. Read to Lead. And it lists and briefly describes 26 books that I believe to be especially valuable as a foundation for movement conservatives. The booklet Read to Lead is accessible for free online. Google for it. So every year I give away to bright students hundreds of copies of excellent books by F.A. Hayek, Milton Friedman, Edmund Burke, Frederick Bastiat, Thomas Sowell, Russell Clark, Paul Johnson, Whittaker Chambers, and others of like mind. But traditionally conservative educational efforts did focus exclusively on teaching about issues in philosophy. That is not, in the main, what I do. Conservatives used not to be able to identify and communicate widely with each other except through the filter of media that was militantly hostile to conservative principles. Now conservatives have direct mail, talk radio, cable news networks, many new types of online communication, and literally thousands of conservative organizations independent of each other, but are capable, each of them, very quickly to communicate facts and conservative opinion and focused calls to action to thousands or millions of fellow conservatives. About conservative politics today. Having defined American conservatives and describing how conservatives became effective in politics, I'm going to devote the rest of this presentation to brief discussions of 4 areas of current concern to politically active conservatives. Those 4 areas are problems and opportunities caused by the left, problems and opportunities caused by political consultants, problems and opportunities within a political party, problems and opportunities among conservatives themselves. First, the left versus conservatives. The left is using the power of government not only to grab more power. The left now uses their power inside government to target and persecute conservatives. Use ruthlessly. The Internal Revenue Service and other government agencies can crush many political opponents and terrorize a great many others. This is a very serious abuse, and what's worse, they have thus far completely gotten away with it. The left in government breaks laws written to prevent abuses. Everyone knows it, but even the most abusive leftist bureaucrats thus far in our country have reason to be confident that they will not be fired, fined, or jailed. The left acts as if people on government payroll are some kind of entitled elite who can with impunity, because they were above the laws and regulations that bind everyone else. Even after exposure for great abuses or disastrous incompetence, the worst that happens to most senior bureaucrats is retirement on a full pension. Historically, Americans have always tolerated some elected politicians and government officials found to have deliberately misled or blatantly lied to the public, and doing this for their personal or political advantage. Sometimes politicians get away with using their power in government to persecute their enemies, or they get away with breaking some laws and unconstitutionally ignoring other laws. Many politicians keep secrets from the public, which would otherwise damage them politically, or they grant major and unethical favors to enrich their political allies, or to give those allies unwarranted advantages over other citizens. The public has come to expect and to suffer a certain amount of such abuses from people inside government. Often most people simply shrug their shoulders and think, well, that's just politics. But when an official's failings become obvious enough and aggravated enough, an outraged public can rise up and hold that official accountable. As scandal after scandal piled up, conservatives recently began to wonder if there were anything the Democrats and the nation's major news media wouldn't help the leftists in government to get away with. Not so much now. Except those who are willfully blind, everybody understands that the left in government lies and misleads the public in order to grab more power through government. Grassroots conservatives and their leaders are delighted to learn that at last there are things that the left can't get away with. That development encourages conservatives to explore other ways to hold leftists accountable in the public policy process for their abuses. Comments on consultants and conservatives. Most political consultants in the United States limit themselves to working either entirely for Republicans or entirely for Democrats. Nevertheless, a few consultants who work only for Republicans can be relied upon to work only in the best interests of conservative principles in the public policy process. Most of these consultants chase after the money wherever they can get it. And I discussed this matter in a long opinion piece entitled the GOP's consultant problem. That's the GOP's consultant problem. I published it in the Daily Caller in 2012, and it's still available online. Consultants usually cannot resist the temptation to recruit as clients as many candidates as they can, as long as their clients have or can raise large sums of money for their campaigns. In Republican nomination contests, this frequently results in many conservative candidates splitting up the conservative vote and in the nomination of the only well-funded, quote, moderate Republican in the race. In recent decades, consultants have often wormed their way into the domination of state or national party committees, and uncounted numbers of candidates have been told by those who control party committees that they must hire designated consultants in order to receive money from those party committees. Conservative candidates and shut-out conservative consultants have achieved limited exposures of these practices, and some party leaders have taken steps to prevent such abuses. Although consultants can legitimately earn money in all aspects of modern election campaigns, the ground war as well as the air war, the big bucks for consultants come from commissionable political advertising. Most political technology is philosophically neutral. Skillfully applied, techniques can work for either side. And it's fair to say that Barack Obama's systematic and now famously successful ground games in 2008 and 2012 were logical extensions of Republican micro-targeting innovations during the George W. Bush administration. Advertising in the U.S. typically includes paying to consultants a commission of 15% of all the sums that are paid to broadcasters or print media to run that advertising. Compared to the labor of creating and running an effective ground game in an election campaign, running an expensive paid advertising campaign is easy and highly profitable for the political consultants. Paid advertising is a goldmine for consultants. They customarily receive fat monthly retainers. They bill campaigns for the creative work required to produce each ad, and they receive big commissions from the public media outlets for all the advertisements that they place. Many unprincipled operatives who are professional lobbyists or political consultants and cultivate access to people in power make all or part of their income consulting with special interests that are actively at odds with conservative principles, such as those that are proclaimed, for example, in the platforms that are crafted and adopted by delegates to Republican national conventions. With some admirable exceptions, political consultants and lobbyists have been thorns in the flesh of conservatives for many years. Some of them are complete opportunists from the start. Others prove their competence initially by achievements for conservative principles through work for conservative employers. But too many in this latter category lose their principles when their reputations enable to increase their income greatly by selling their services on the open market to any employers, regardless of their agendas, as long as those employers have fat wallets. For many reasons, wise conservatives have learned to trust and hire only consultants who have demonstrated clearly a commitment to work exclusively for conservative Republican candidates and causes. And now, specific to the United States, conservatives and the Republican Party. It is not easy to change a major political party, but changing a political party in the United States today is much, much easier than creating a new major party. By the 1970s, the left had begun using government in wide-ranging attacks on what are now called social issues. Until then, those issues had long been considered as settled in the United States and outside of the public policy process. As a result of leftist attacks through the public policy process, millions of conservative people who were social conservatives and had been previously inactive in politics became political participants to defend themselves, and this was much to the benefit and political success of the Republican Party. Current calls for a, quote, truce in the Republican Party on social issues are not new. Starting in the 1970s, some wildly publicized nominal Republicans who claimed to be fiscal conservatives began to urge loudly that conservatives committed to traditional moral values should stop supporting their principles through political advocacy and participation. But the liberals, of course, have no intention of stopping their use of government power systematically against traditional values. Content-free Republicans today know that full well, but they act as if they expect millions of traditional values conservatives to support Republican candidates who are silent about or even left-wing on social issues. Fat chance that will work. There are some current signals that big business interests will intervene financially in Republican nomination contests against the candidates, against candidates who refuse to abandon their public advocacy of conservative social issues. Big business interests should not expect Republican nominees to win many elections if grassroots conservatives most committed on social issues decide that the Republican Party is useless to them. New waves of active conservatives nominated Barry Goldwater in 1964 and nominated and elected Ronald Reagan in 1980. These newcomers were undoubtedly decisive in the 2010 national elections and the victories of many other conservative Republicans over the last 50 years. And moreover, the new activists do not drop out of politics. Many, like me from the Goldwater era, are still alive. Social issue conservatives who, with Ronald Reagan, changed the direction of America in 1980, still work effectively in the public policy process. Waves of new participants continue this process. For example, in Virginia, my home state, in 2012, longtime movement conservatives worked closely with Tea Party activists who were new to politics and overturned the Republican establishment control of the state party. Similarly, united coalitions have won important internal Republican state party elections in many states, including places as diverse as Maryland, Delaware, Iowa, Missouri, Michigan, and even Massachusetts. This process is cumulative. Huge numbers of new activists who get their first taste of politics in grassroots activity in one election keep fighting for their principles for decades to come. Always, some of them become a new generation of conservative leaders in elections for public office, legislative battles, and intra-party contests. Few Americans, and almost no one elsewhere, understand the fundamental structural difference between political parties in the United States and political parties elsewhere. In almost every country, political parties are completely centralized and are run almost entirely from the top down. In some countries, political parties are created as vehicles entirely for the benefit of one politician, and those parties often fade away when that politician drops from prominence. Our U.S. political parties are constructed on a model similar to the structure James Madison built into the U.S. Constitution. That is, internally, the parties include separations of power and what amount to checks and balances. Our major parties, especially the Republican Party, are not centralized or unitary. The Republican Party of each state and territory, regardless of its population size, elects 3 members of the Republican National Committee, its state party chairman, a National Committee man, and a National Committee woman. I am currently the Virginia Republican National Committee man, and I rank 3rd in tenure among the 168 Republican National Committee members. The Republican National Committee raises hundreds of millions of dollars and sometimes provides staff and often provides substantial financial help to state parties and to candidates below the presidential level. But its main legal functions are to arrange every 4 years for the presidential nomination conventions and then to support the election of Republican nominees for president and vice president. Okay, thanks. Right. Most people assume that the Republican National Committee controls the entire Republican Party. Not so. There are the National Republican Congressional Committee, which exists to elect Republican members of the House, and National Republican Senatorial Committee, which focuses on the election of U.S. senators. And these 2 national organizations are organizationally completely independent of the Republican National Committee. Similarly, there's a Republican Governors Association that operates separately from the Republican National Committee or the Congressional Committee or the Senatorial Committee. And its function is to elect Republican governors. Nationally, there's a myriad of independent Republican auxiliary groups, and they thrive, such as the National Federation of Republican Women, Young Republican National Federation, College Republican National Committee, the National Teenage Republicans, the Hispanic Republican Assembly, et cetera, et cetera. There are dozens of them. But none of these party committees and party auxiliaries I have mentioned has the legal power, individually or in combination, to tell each other what to do. Each elected official has his own campaign committee, which can raise and spend money without control from a party committee. Okay. I'm just cutting this a bit short. I'll close with this. The way to grow a party is to treat newcomers fairly, politely, and even cordially, and to show them that power in the party frequently flows from the bottom up rather than the top down. And I'm closing with comments about conservative problems among themselves. Unity is easier in an embattled minority where survival is at risk. Centrifugal forces grow in strength after a principled minority defeats its opposition, and foolish elements of the new majority who are heady with success start taking actions that are grossly offensive to other groups in their coalition, and that is always a mistake. Power does tend to corrupt, and success stimulates hubris, as Republicans sometimes find out to our sorrow. Conservatives and libertarians now have it in their power to cooperate using a political party to build a stable governing majority. Leftist Democrats and content-free Republicans are not persuaded by sweet reason to change their ways. nor will many of them change for fear of future defeats by conservatives and libertarians. Some content-free Republican officials and party leaders will have to be replaced before the party can be reliable for conservative principles. Only a critical mass of principled conservatives and libertarians can preserve and advance their principles, and only if they work together and do not compromise in ways that accept the left's power grabs as permanent. Conservative principles may be defeated in some elections and legislative battles, but they can triumph in the long run if they faithfully uphold those principles as the alternative to the left's agenda. Using a major party as its principal vehicle, resurgent libertarians and conservatives will break the statist consensus in a political party if they nominate many people who could not have been elected in recent times. And I believe this is true in Brazil. And that can be achieved through more widespread understanding of the real nature of politics, which will lead to greater grassroots political participation and the development and emergence of many new leaders. Thank you.
Mr. Blackwell, amazing speech. On behalf of the whole organization, we thank you so much for coming over to Brazil.
Nice to meet you.
All right.
I appreciate the invitation.
Amazing stuff. Thank you. É isso, pessoal. Depois de mais um baita discurso de quem viveu, quem estava lá fazendo acontecer com a mão na massa, viu a história se desenrolar diante dos próprios olhos, a gente encerra aqui agora em grande estilo. Finalizando, eu declaro encerrada, em grande estilo, a 9ª edição do Fórum Liberdade e Democracia. Agradecer demais, novamente, a todos os associados e grupos envolvidos hoje aqui, pelo convite, pela oportunidade. E eu tenho certeza que todos nós vamos iniciar esse final de semana e seguir adiante, muito mais equipados aí para ter certeza de propósito, foco, força e fé olhando adiante. Então, meu muito obrigado, de coração, e vou convocar aqui todos os associados do IFL para a gente tirar a foto oficial do evento aqui no palco, por favor. E os grupos também envolvidos no evento. Então, por favor, se direcionem aqui. Aglomeração liberada, vamos que vamos. Passou. Esse foi até mais rápido.